Renewed protests in Egypt despite the heavy crackdown, and the U.S. begins playing its pressure cards. But how far can Washington go in dealing with the ongoing crisis in Egypt? And is cutting military aid a possibility? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. Well, 2 days after a massive security crackdown killed hundreds of people, Egypt is bracing for more confrontation. Protesters are marching in several cities. They promise to hold a day of rage following Friday prayers. And in a move that may lay the ground for more bloodshed, the Interior Ministry has authorised the use of live ammunition against anyone who attacks government buildings. They've also promised to stop any protesters trying to hold sit-ins. US President Barack Obama broke his silence on Thursday and condemned the violence in Egypt. That promoted an angry response from the country's interim government, which said Obama doesn't understand the facts. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Let me say that the Egyptian people deserve better than what we've seen over the last several days. And to the Egyptian people, let me say the cycle of violence and escalation needs to stop. We call on the Egyptian authorities to respect the universal rights of the people. We call on those who are protesting to do so peacefully and condemn the attacks that we've seen by protesters, including on churches. We believe that the state of emergency should be lifted, that a process of national reconciliation should begin, that all parties need to have a voice in Egypt's future, that the rights of women and religious minorities should be respected, and that commitments must be kept to pursue transparent reforms of the Constitution and democratic elections of a parliament and a president.
Well, despite the sharp criticism, President Obama stopped short of using what is considered his strongest leverage against Egypt, military aid. The U.S. gives Egypt $1.3 billion of military aid every year, and the White House has gone to great lengths to make sure it is protected. U.S. law calls for foreign aid to be suspended following a coup, but Obama has avoided using the word, instead describing Mohamed Morsi's departure from power as a military intervention. Military aid forms a bigger part of relations between the two countries. Those relations are set by a 1979 peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, which the U.S. sees as an anchor of stability in the region. And finally, Egypt has also played a central role in helping the U.S. battle al-Qaeda and other violent groups. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by our three guests. From Washington, D.C., PJ Crowley from the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, George Washington University, and a former Assistant Secretary of the State Department and a State Department spokesperson. From Dubai, we have Salma Musa, a researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, Doha, and from London, Nadeem Shahadi, an Associate Fellow on the Middle East and North Africa Program, Chatham House. Good to have you all with us. PJ Crowley, if I could start with you. As a former State Department man and someone who worked under this administration, what do you make of the U.S. reaction to events in Egypt over the past couple of days?
Well, it makes an already difficult march towards democracy that much harder. What we're seeing is a fragmentation of the political realm in Egypt, polarization that's going to make it difficult to achieve the stated goal, which is a return to civilian rule and, more importantly, an inclusive democracy in an aggressive timeline of 6 to 9 months. Should they have done more? Well, I think we're dealing with decisions made in Egypt and mistakes that are being made in Egypt. The United States is an influential country. It does have the ear of the generals who are the de facto leaders of the country right now. But obviously, whatever advice the United States is giving, it doesn't appear that the generals are following it. Obviously, the president gave a strong message yesterday. I'm sure the generals heard that message. As you said, they've already reacted to it. He maintains this one significant lever, being military aid. But we have to put that in context as well. Obviously, $1 billion is a lot of money, and the United States has established relationships with the Egyptian military. That said, there are other countries in the region that are already also contributing far more significant sums, to move Egypt in a perhaps slightly different direction. So the United States' influence is there, but it's not necessarily decisive.
Salman Musa, as well as the strong condemnation from President Obama, there was also the decision to stop military exercises in Egypt. That was one clear way the White House could show its displeasure. It was perhaps the first significant U.S. move to penalize Egypt's military, but is it going to be enough?
Well, I don't think we should really overstate the importance of cutting off that military exercise, Operation Bright Star. I mean, in one sense, it's more important because it's symbolic. It shows that the U.S. is criticizing what's happening in Egypt. They're saying that the status quo can't continue, and they're, like you said, expressing their displeasure. But at the same time, I mean, this military exercise is pretty inconsequential, especially for the United States. It's not particularly important. There's a much more important joint security operation that's a counterterrorism exercise that's happening next month that'll probably go ahead. Both sides have an interest in that going forward. But like I said, Bright Star, not particularly influential either way. It's more symbolic. It's more just expressing displeasure, but without making any more bold commitments in terms of foreign policy stances.
Nadeem Shahadi, what's your view on this? Has President Obama gone far enough at this point, at least? Should he be doing more?
Well, I think that the United States is definitely an important player, and the message that the army or the military establishment did not get is much more important than the message they are getting today. The lack of a strong message before the coup happened almost signaled that it would be tolerated, and after the coup, the statements were quite weak. The statement of Secretary Kerry in Moscow, and the army thought that it had the green light to carry on and do a state of emergency. And the army as an establishment has been ruling Egypt for 60 years, and these are measures they can do in their sleep. These are instruments of power, state of emergency, and they're very comfortable using.
PJ Crowley, there is this view that the United States missed an opportunity from the beginning by not calling this a coup from the start. Do you share that view?
Well, I would have called it a coup, not only to send a signal to the Egyptian military, but also to send in a signal to the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, the greater challenge right now, again, if the goal is inclusive democracy, then getting the Muslim Brotherhood to commit back into a political process that it has reason to believe is being rigged against it is vitally important. If the Muslim Brotherhood chooses not to participate in the rewriting of the Constitution, or is not allowed to participate in the rewriting of the Constitution or participation in a meaningful way in the parliamentary or the presidential elections, then all we've done is changed one political constituency for another without achieving the broader objective. So I disagree with Nadeem in that, while yes, I can see the point that there was at a point a recognition that this coup was going to happen, despite what I understand was stern advice by the United States not to go through with it. By the same token, I do believe that the establishment of an emergency law was a surprise to the administration, and I think that was the trigger that yielded the strong statements yesterday.
But as a follow-up to that, PJ Crowley, the consequences of the United States calling this a coup, as you know, under U.S. law, would be an immediate cutoff of its military aid to Egypt. Is that something that the United States should give up so quickly? Because that is a strong piece of leverage, isn't it?
Well, I think that's more of a tactical question. I think what the president did yesterday was to put the aid on the table as a card that can be played depending on what happens in the coming days and the coming weeks. So we may disagree about the timing of that, but so I think there is still an opportunity to send a clear signal to the generals. You're going too far. But again, the greater challenge to me is not communicating with the with the Egyptian military. It's communicating with the Muslim Brotherhood. You know, we've had emissaries, both Catherine Ashton, Deputy Secretary of State Bill Burns, have both been to Cairo communicating with the Muslim Brotherhood and trying to entice them back into the process. I mean, that remains to me the missing link, if you will, if we're going to move Egypt in a direction that everyone wants to see it go.
Salman Musa, you share that view that there needs to be more communication with the opposition side and with the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, actually, I think that there has been a lot of communication with the Muslim Brotherhood already. There were already 2 plans, I believe, that were put forward in the third-party negotiations that were put forth by the U.S. And some of the EU players as well, which is, I think there's a lot of close communication with Chuck Hagel and El-Sisi and John Kerry, and they put together, these 2 alternatives. And then the way that they framed it was that the Muslim Brotherhood agreed to those terms, but that the El-Sisi and the Egyptian military refused them up until the last kind of like the final hour before the crackdown. But actually, even then, I don't know how much good that would do, because it could very well be that the Muslim Brotherhood would bluff and say that they're in for these kind of negotiations because they know that the military will be against them. So they can kind of put their hands up and say, well, we tried the political option, it didn't work. So you're not even really sure about the true ideological kind of commitment to those kind of negotiations. And I just want to point out, too, that, just a couple of weeks ago when there was supposed to be a national reconciliation meeting, a meeting for national dialogue, and the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists actually withdrew from that meeting the day before. So I'm not really sure if we can overstate the willingness of the opposition to engage in those kind of mediations.
Nadeem Shahedi, should there be more willingness on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood and its supporters to get back to put some sort of political dialogue?
Well, I think one of the posters that a protester was carrying today says it all. He said that he's an ordinary citizen, that they participated in an election, and the parliament was dissolved. They voted they did a referendum for a constitution, and it was abrogated, and they voted for a president. He was deposed, and they did a peaceful protest, and they were killed. So I think that it will be difficult not to have the extremists amongst the Brotherhood get the upper hand after what happened in the next 2 days. But I want to also say something about the military aid. I think the military aid is a two-way instrument, in the sense that it's almost like blood money. It's the military, the establishment in Egypt, uses it as it's a form of extortion, that if you don't pay the money, then something will happen on the Israeli-Palestinian front, or we will cancel the Camp David Treaty, or the military establishment knows how to manipulate and extort by using the Israeli card and the peace process card.
PJ Crowley, I saw you.
I don't think the United States is in a strong position with the military aid.
Mm-hmm. PJ Crowley, I saw you nodding in agreement to that. That the issue of military aid to Egypt, it's a two-way street then.
Well, I agree with Nadeem that once you establish a certain status quo, and we should stress that you cannot look at Egypt in isolation, because it has ripple effects. If Egypt goes well, that sends a strong signal across the region. If Egypt continues to descend into chaos, that will also have ripple effects in other ways. But I totally agree that once you've established this form of assistance for a particular broad purpose, disrupting that is very, very difficult for bureaucracies to do. And I think that's part of why the Obama administration has hesitated. But I do think that the president sent an indirect signal yesterday that if the current course continues, that the aid could be in jeopardy.
Salman Musa, is there a sense here that the U.S. is simply sort of playing catch-up in all of this, in all of the events that we've seen in Egypt over the last 6 weeks, rather than that they're simply reacting all the time rather than being more proactive?
Yeah, I mean, I think the U.S. has kind of found itself kind of out of its depth here in a way, and it's just a continuation of something that's been happening, if you look at it, for decades, not even just the past 6 weeks. I think the criticism of Obama's response, even at the January 25th revolution, was pretty intense, and even then it was a lot less bloody than what's happening now. And then you see the U.S. kind of on the fence trying to play this balancing act. They don't want to alienate the generals, but at the same time they don't want to alienate the Brotherhood. And in the end, they ended up with no friends in Cairo and very little influence. So I think they are playing catch up, but at the same time, I really don't think there's much that the U.S. can do. I mean, we keep talking about this, the military aid as this kind of like magic tool of, of foreign policy. It's really, as Mr. Crowley pointed out earlier, it's really not that effective of a tool. I mean, it's not that consequential. There's alternatives in the region. The UAE, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia already pledged $12 billion. That really dwarfs, the U.S.'s aid by comparison. So I think the U.S. has been trying to play it really safe, and they've kind of alienated all sides. And I think they've lost what little credibility they kind of did have in the region. But that's not really that surprising to me.
Nadim Shehadi, what's your view on this? Is the U.S. administration sending too many mixed signals on Egypt?
Yes, I mean it's sending too many, and sometimes no signal at all. And I think it's the same in Syria. It's sending the wrong signals on. It reminds me of what Prime Minister Churchill said here, that the US will do the right thing, but only after it's tried every other alternative. And but I still think that the US is the main power in the region and has the influence to get things right in Egypt and in the rest of the region. It's just that this administration, I'm afraid, has not decided yet what its role is going to be.
PJ Crowley, if you talk to a lot of Egyptians right now on both sides of this, they haven't got a lot of good things to say about the United States these days. If you talk to the anti-coup protesters, they will say that the condemnation that we've heard from the United States and the reaction so far has not been nearly tough enough. And we've already heard the reaction from the interim government about what President Obama had to say on Thursday. I mean, what does that tell you about the current U.S. policy then? That there seems to be breeding more distrust on both sides than anything else.
Well, I think Salma's analysis is quite correct, and to some extent, the United States is in a no-win situation because there's not one view in the region. There are several views in the region, and anything the United States does, is going to trigger a response of some kind. I mean, to Nadim's point, in fairness, I would say, look. The Obama administration came in after the Bush administration. Obviously, Obama doesn't want to make the same kinds of mistakes that his predecessor did. Iraq would be a good example of that, and obviously that colors, what we've seen in various situations, Syria being paramount among them. But in fairness, I would say, look, tell me what the region's view is of what's happening, and then we can talk. I mean, obviously, if you look back over the past couple of years, there was a consensus within the Arab League, for example, regarding action on Libya. Obviously, Gaddafi had few friends in the region. That reflected the Arab invitation for the NATO intervention. There's been a paralysis within the region in the context of what to really do about Syria, and obviously that has influenced the United States keeping Syria at arm's length. The United States has a keen interest in what happens in Egypt, but in fairness, these are decisions that are going to be made in Egypt, good ones and bad ones. This is not a situation that lends itself to the imposition of a solution from the outside.
Well, you mentioned Syria earlier there, PJ Crowley, and I want to ask you about the words red lines, which is something that was often used in reference to Syria and what's happening there, and President Obama saying that the use of chemical weapons with regard to Syria would be a red line. Is there a red line with Egypt if the violence continues up to a certain point? Will the U.S. have to react in a more decisive way?
Well, I would go to the desired end state and then work backwards, and we are approaching a pivotal point. You know, the stated U.S. policy, which is ostensibly the stated goal of the interim government, is to return to civilian rule and correct what it perceives as the inadequacies of the Morsi government. Obviously, that means a rewriting of the Constitution, but making the political space in Egypt far more inclusive than was the case over the past year or year and a half. Now the onus is on Egypt to actually create conditions in a process that yields that result. I think we are very close to determining, if not already there, that that's going to be very, very difficult under the current circumstances. So I think the United States will respond to what the interim government does. If the confrontation with protesters, and of course you've got dual narratives there, they're protesters, but the language of the interim government is to call them terrorists. They're not. So the onus is on the Egyptian government. You've got to get back to what your stated goal which was the justification of the coup, what the president called a military intervention. At a point where that does not seem feasible, and we see a drift back to the autocratic or military-dominated rule that was eliminated from Egypt 2 years ago, that will have grave implications in terms of the character of the U.S.-Egyptian relationship going forward.
All right. Going forward then, Salma Musa, how do you see this playing out? Are there red lines as far as the U.S. sees it that shouldn't be crossed?
I mean, to be honest, even if there were red lines, I mean, like, what could the U.S. response possibly be? Like we said already, the only tool really is the military aid. Let's say you cut that. I mean, it's desirable, but it's not absolutely crucial for the Egyptian military to have that. So, and I don't think military intervention is anything the U.S. is seriously considering with Egypt, and rightfully so. So even if there were red lines, I mean, I don't know what more the Egyptian military currently, or the police or the security forces, I don't know what more they could do other than the brutal crackdown, however you want to term it. I mean, I don't think chemical warfare is something that would seriously happen. I think it's just what I think the most they're going to go is live ammunition anyway. So I don't think that's something we really have to worry about, particularly about the red lines. And even if there were some, like I said, I don't think the U.S. response would be particularly consequential.
All right, final thoughts then in the last couple of minutes or so that we've got left to you, Nadim Shehadi. How do you see this playing out then?
Yes, well, I agree with PJ. I mean, but I'd like to frame it in a different way. That the U.S. has a credibility problem in the whole region because of the way it reacted, or lack of reaction to Syria, and it needs to resolve its credibility problem regionally. It's a superpower that needs to be credible. Otherwise, all the instruments will not suffice. And in addition, I think Iraq has a great influence, and this administration has locked itself in a narrative that Iraq was a mistake and was a defeat and all that. It defined itself as not Bush, so it cannot, in a way, talk about intervention or regime change or any of the Bush language without compromising what it has invested a lot in, which is engagement.
Yeah, I mean, PJ Crowley, Nadim Shehadi brings up a valid point there about Iraq. Is the ghost of Iraq still haunting U.S. policy in the Middle East?
Well, let's define what the ghost is. Certainly to have the United States intervene without meaningful support from other countries in the region that are still dealing with the consequences of what happened in Iraq, I think that was a mistake. So, but I think this is where in fairness to Nadim, there's no regional consensus in terms of what to do about Syria. Ergo, it's hard to see how the United States can play a decisive role until there's a greater consensus that exists now. There's probably 4 or 5 different policies at play, depending on on which element of the neighborhood you're talking about. There is a desire by the Obama administration to try to work to gain as much support for whatever international response there is, whether it's Syria or Egypt or any of the other challenges in the region. That's what it's seeking. But obviously, at the end of the day, these are just very, very difficult and complex issues. And the decisive decisions we made inside the region, not beyond.
All right, on that note, we're going to have to leave it. Thank you to all of our guests, PJ Crowley, Salma Musa, and Nadeem Shihadi. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Remember, if you want to send us your feedback, email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. And if you're on Twitter, you can tweet me at Hazem Seeker. Thanks again for watching. Bye for now.